In the year 1792, Europe was set alight by revolution. What began as a political uprising in France soon ignited a chain reaction that would consume the continent for more than 2 decades. Monarchies trembled, empires shifted, and war became a constant presence across land and sea. At the heart of this struggle was a question that would define the age: who would control Europe, and who would rule the oceans? On land, France produced a general unlike any the world had seen before, Napoleon Bonaparte. At sea, Britain placed its faith in timber, canvas, iron, and discipline, and in the men who commanded its ships. Among those men, one name would rise above all others: Horatio Nelson. By the turn of the 19th century, Britain's survival depended on its navy. Cut off from continental Europe, the island nation relied on sea power to protect its trade, its colonies, and its very existence. The Royal Navy was not just a military force, it was Britain's lifeline. And yet, in the frozen waters of northern Europe, that lifeline was about to be tested. The birth of a dangerous alliance. In 1800, Europe's enemies saw an opportunity. France, though dominant on land, struggled to challenge Britain at sea. But if Britain could be weakened indirectly through trade restrictions and diplomatic pressure, its naval supremacy might crumble. This idea found support in an unlikely place: the courts of Northern Europe. Russia, Sweden, Denmark, and Prussia, officially neutral powers, grew increasingly angry at British naval practices. Britain claimed the right to stop, search, and detain neutral ships suspected of trading with France. To the British, this was a necessary weapon of war. To others, it was an insult to sovereignty. Under the leadership of Tsar Paul I of Russia, these nations formed the League of Armed Neutrality. Its purpose was simple: to defend neutral shipping against British interference, by force if necessary. For Britain, the implications were alarming. The Baltic Sea was vital. From its ports came timber, tar, hemp, and pitch, essential materials for building and repairing warships. If access to the Baltic was denied, Britain's navy would slowly grind to a halt. Worse still, the combined fleets of Russia, Denmark, and Sweden posed a real threat. Together, they could challenge British dominance in northern waters. Britain concluded that diplomacy had failed. If the League could not be broken by words, it would be broken by force. A fleet sailed north. In early 1801, a powerful British fleet set sail for the Baltic. At its head was Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, a senior officer with experience on paper but little first-hand knowledge of Baltic waters. He was cautious, methodical, and deeply conscious of risk. Serving under him was Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. By now, Nelson was already a legend. He had shattered a Spanish fleet at Cape St. Vincent. He had annihilated the French navy at the Battle of the Nile. He had lost an arm, sight in one eye, and countless friends, but gained the absolute trust of the British public. Nelson was bold, aggressive, and utterly convinced that speed and decisiveness won battles. From the moment the fleet entered the Baltic, tension grew between the two commanders. Nelson wanted action, Parker wanted caution, and time was slipping away. Denmark in the crossfire. Britain chose Denmark as its first target, not because it was the strongest member of the League, but because it was the most exposed. The Danish fleet was anchored near Copenhagen, protected by coastal defenses and shallow waters. Denmark hoped its neutrality and the League would protect it. Instead, it found itself staring down the guns of the world's most powerful navy. An ultimatum was delivered. leave the League and allow British ships free passage or face attack. The Danish response was firm. They refused. Nelson's impatience. As days passed, the British fleet was delayed by poor winds and Parker's hesitation. Each delay allowed the Danes to strengthen their defenses. Nelson grew increasingly frustrated. He wrote to Parker, warning that every hour worked against them. The Danish positions, once incomplete and undermanned, were rapidly improving. If Britain waited too long, the attack might become impossible. Finally, at the end of March, the fleet arrived off Copenhagen. What Nelson saw concerned him. The Danes had anchored a line of warships and hulks along a narrow channel known as King's Deep. Though many ships were old or unfit for sea, they were packed with guns and could function as floating batteries. Shore fortifications supported them, including the powerful Trekroner fort, armed with heavy cannon and mortars. Between the British and their target lay dangerous shoals, invisible beneath the water's surface. Any mistake would be fatal.
Yet even in victory, Nelson knew how close the battle had come to disaster. 3 of his most powerful ships had run aground. Had the wind shifted, had the smoke cleared differently, had Danish resistance held just a little longer, Copenhagen might have become a catastrophe instead of a triumph. As British ships limped away from the harbor, damaged hulls scraping the shoals, the narrow channel of King's Deep seemed almost to mock them. The same waters that had allowed victory could just as easily have trapped and destroyed the fleet. The cost had been high. More than 200 British sailors lay dead. Hundreds more were wounded. Danish losses were even heavier. Sailors, soldiers, and civilian volunteers who had stood their ground against the world's most powerful navy. Among the dead was Captain Edward Rieu, killed while leading a desperate attack against the guns of Trekroner Fort. His final words echoed the brutal courage of the age, a refusal to retreat, even when death was certain. Copenhagen was not a clean victory. It was not effortless. It was a battle won through endurance, improvisation, and sheer will. But politically, its impact was immediate. Within days, events beyond the battlefield reshaped the entire conflict. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Paul I, the driving force behind the League of Armed Neutrality, was murdered in his palace by his own officers. His successor abandoned the League's aggressive stance almost at once. Denmark, suddenly isolated and vulnerable, agreed to suspend its participation. Sweden followed. The League of Armed Neutrality collapsed before it had truly begun. Britain's access to the Baltic was secured. The flow of timber, tar, and naval supplies resumed. The Royal Navy could breathe again. For Horatio Nelson, Copenhagen became both triumph and controversy. He had disobeyed a direct signal from his commanding officer. Under different circumstances, such defiance could have ended his career or even his life. But Nelson understood something others had not. Victory in that moment depended on pressing forward, not pulling back. Britain rewarded him accordingly. Admiral Parker was recalled to England. Nelson was promoted to command the fleet. Titles, honors, and public admiration followed. Yet Nelson himself seemed restless. He understood that Copenhagen was not the end of the struggle, merely another chapter. France remained undefeated on land. Napoleon's ambitions were growing. Peace treaties were fragile things, easily shattered by ambition and mistrust. And Nelson knew that the sea would decide the final outcome. In the years that followed, Europe would briefly taste peace, but it would not last. Less than 4 years later, Nelson would once again take command of a fleet. Once again, he would face a French enemy. Once again, Britain's fate would rest on his decisions. That final battle would be fought off the coast of Spain at a place called Trafalgar. There, Nelson would achieve the greatest naval victory in British history, and there he would fall. But his legacy would endure, not just as a commander who won battles, but as a leader who understood when rules must be followed and when they must be broken. Because history is not shaped by caution alone. It is shaped by those willing to act, even when the cost is everything. And that is the legacy of Horatio Nelson. That is the lesson of Copenhagen. And this has been another golden story.
In the weeks after Copenhagen, Britain celebrated Nelson as the man who had saved the Baltic. Newspapers praised his courage. Crowds admired his scars. Politicians applauded the result, even if they quietly ignored the way it had been achieved. Nelson himself was more reflective. He knew that the victory had depended on more than bravery. It had depended on preparation, on discipline, and on the absolute trust he placed in his captains and crews. Without that trust, chaos would have consumed the battle within minutes. Yet Copenhagen also exposed the brutal reality of modern naval warfare. Ships that never moved, men fighting at distances so close they could hear the enemy shout, cannon fire tearing bodies apart without warning. Courage mattered, but survival was often a matter of chance. As negotiations dragged on in Copenhagen, Nelson was drawn into diplomacy as well as war. He impressed the Danes by openly praising their resistance, remarking that they had fought with a determination the French rarely showed. It was not just flattery. Nelson understood something crucial. Respect could end conflicts faster than threats. Gradually, hostilities eased. Danish ports reopened to British ships. Supplies flowed once more. Britain's immediate crisis was over, but Europe remained unstable. Napoleon, now First Consul of France, was consolidating power. Though peace talks continued, both sides understood the truth. This was a pause, not an ending. In 1802, the Treaty of Amiens brought temporary peace between Britain and France. For the first time in nearly a decade, Europe experienced a fragile calm. Nelson returned home. But peace did not sit easily with him. He was a man shaped by action, not waiting. His health was failing. Old wounds caused constant pain. His private life, entangled with Emma Hamilton, drew scandal as well as fascination. And beneath it all lay a restless certainty. Peace would not last. By 1803, Nelson was proven right. War resumed. Napoleon's ambitions had not faded, they had expanded. He now planned the impossible, an invasion of Britain itself. For this, he needed control of the Channel. Once again, the fate of Europe would depend on the sea. Nelson was recalled to service. He took command of the Mediterranean fleet, tasked with hunting down the French navy wherever it sailed. For nearly 2 years, he chased shadows, fleets that slipped away, plans that shifted constantly. The strain was immense. Months at sea, endless patrols, no decisive engagement. Yet Nelson remained relentless. He believed that one great battle could end the threat forever. In 1805, that moment finally came. Napoleon's fleet, reinforced by Spanish ships, broke from port and sailed toward the Atlantic. Nelson pursued them across thousands of miles of ocean back toward Europe. The chase ended off the coast of Spain, at Cape Trafalgar. On the morning of October 21, 1805, 2 fleets faced each other in rising seas. 33 French and Spanish ships against 27 British. Nelson studied the enemy line. Then he made a decision as bold as Copenhagen and far more dangerous. Instead of forming a traditional battle line, he divided his fleet into 2 columns and drove them straight at the enemy. It violated convention, it invited destruction, but it promised annihilation. As his flagship HMS Victory advanced, Nelson prepared his final signal, a message that would echo through history. England expects that every man will do his duty. The battle that followed was savage beyond description. Ships smashed together, gunfire tore through hulls, smoke turned day into darkness. Victory was achieved through close combat, boarding actions, and relentless pressure. Nelson's tactics shattered the enemy fleet. One by one, French and Spanish ships surrendered or were destroyed. Britain's naval supremacy was secured, not for years, but for generations. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. As Nelson paced the deck of HMS Victory, a musket ball fired from the French ship Redoutable struck him in the shoulder. It passed through his body and lodged in his spine. He fell. Carried below decks, Nelson knew instantly the wound was fatal. For hours, as the battle raged above, he lay dying, refusing morphine, only asking for news of the fight. When he learned that victory was certain, he allowed himself a final moment of peace. "Thank God," he whispered, "I have done my duty." Horatio Nelson died before the guns fell silent. Britain mourned him as a hero beyond compare. His funeral became a national event. His memory became legend. Yet his true legacy was not just in victory. It was in understanding that leadership demands courage, not just to fight, but to decide. Copenhagen had shown the danger of hesitation. Trafalgar proved the power of conviction. Together, they defined an age. Because history is not shaped by those who wait for perfect conditions. It is shaped by those who act when the moment demands it. And that is why Horatio Nelson still matters. That is why his battles are remembered.